David, the
Hey.
last couple of months, my Instagram feed has been bombarded with CEOs from companies like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, essentially coming down with an iron hammer and talking about Gen Z a lot, for better or for worse. What is the kind of general sentiment that you have seen from leaders when it comes to managing Gen Z employees?
Well, that's a big topic. So I think the best example I can give is if I'm sat in a room, either professionally or personally, and I just talk about, I'm focused on Gen Z and how we can develop that generation, develop the workplace, I just get an eye roll. Everyone rolls their eyes, or they raise an eyebrow, or they're like, oh. You ask, well, why? And everyone does that. Now, they have a slightly different opinion as to what's triggering that, but the point is everyone has at least a perception of an issue. And why is that? Why is there a whole generational issue going on? And that's when it gets really complicated. Because everyone I talk to has a problem where they're not getting the results that they want. So it might be the fact they feel that Gen Z just aren't committed. They don't want to be there. There's a lack of work ethic, perceived lack of work ethic. And I want to make sure I highlight the word perception a lot during this, because what I am not is an advocate for kind of bashing Gen Z, but there is a perception among most leaders that there is a work ethic issue, that there is a commitment issue, that there's a resilience issue, that there's a communication issue, there's a lack of ambition for the future, an extended fear of failure. There are so many different issues that are associated with that generation that leaders are either frustrated or they're angry or they're giving up on them in some cases. There are some small business leaders that I talk to who are now more focused on obviously AI, as we were touching on earlier, virtual assistants, so hiring workers in South Africa or the Philippines, or just any solution they can come up with, which means they don't have to deal with their perception of a problem.
I think there's actually a couple of valid points there. I think I'm 25 years old, so I can maybe speak for Gen Z. I think maybe there is actually a lack of ambition. What, from your perspective, where do you think that stems from?
So as I was touching on before we went on camera, I think the more I've researched this, and I've been researching and reading and talking now for some years. So my background is all leadership, but this specific problem I've been dealing with probably since 2022. So good 3 years of just reading and looking at this. So there's no simple answer to that. But I think a number of factors all coalesce at the same time. And that's part of this whole problem, is there's so many things going on at the same time that it's creating this whole raft of problems. But to answer your question, I think the biggest reasons for this is ambition stems generally from a hope for the future. So we are ambitious because we believe there's something we can achieve or get to in the future through the efforts we put in now. Through no fault of their own, there is a perception, I think, either consciously or subconsciously, that hope for the future is not clear for people. And if you don't see that hope for the future, why would you have ambition? So some examples for that. So if you look at pure economics, the last boom within the UK, and we're talking UK here, although this issue is global, but I'll take a UK example for our audience, that the last boom was from about early 90s to 2008. It's about a 17-year period. Now, most of Gen Z, I'm sure you'd agree with this, don't really remember that period of time. 2007, you probably weren't paying any attention to the economic environment whatsoever, and quite right too. But from the moment you became conscious of the economic environment, all you've ever heard about is recession and stagnation. So just as an economic example, if your whole lived experience has been negative, why would you believe that's going to be any better for the future? So that's just one example. Second example is just the kind of social, cultural context of ambition and hope and energy and drive. And unfortunately, the UK context, I think, since Brexit, massively since COVID, has been quite a negative vibe, for want of a better word. You know, if you spent 2 years at your most sort of adult developmental period, so 2 years over university or late school, whatever it might be, and you spent 2 years in a lockdown context where everything was a bit negative, everything was very pessimistic, everything was, don't do this, don't take a risk, don't push yourself out there, stay at home, be safe. That lowers your aspirational boundaries. It lowers your expectation of successful outcomes because you've just had your world closed down. Again, that's not your fault. That's not Gen Z's fault. That was just the context within which they developed at that stage of their lives. That has an impact. You then look at some of the big macro things that are going on at the moment. So the whole world is in flux more than it was, say, when I was growing up. And that leaves a lack of, well, where are we going? Everything seems so chaotic. What's happening next? God knows. You've got the climate crisis. And I think the younger generation are, generally speaking, more attuned to that and the risk that comes with that. And where do we go next? What happens next? Is it worth it? And then you look at AI. And I think that's probably the biggest point now. Maybe not, up for debate. But there are still plenty of leaders today who will say to the younger generation, you do this, you work hard, and in 5 years' time, you'll get this. Or in 10 years' time, you might be in for a shot at partnership if you're working really hard. Anyone in Gen Z who is intelligent enough to see what's coming will go, why on earth would I believe that? In 5 years' time, my role, this company will have radically changed because of the acceleration of technology. So if I can look ahead 5 years and go, well, my role's not going to look like it is now. Your role, my boss, your role's not going to look like it is now. In fact, it probably may well not even exist, or certainly not in its current form. So why would I feel inspired by that? Why would I have ambition to go for that when it's not going to exist? It's a mirage. So I think for those reasons and many others, that traditional driver of ambition, just they're not there. So we have to find other ways of communicating that and helping people to see a better future and something to aspire to.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. So I guess from my perspective, my mum and dad are 49 and 52. And when they were my age, they grew up in a world where the middle class boomed. There's globalization, lots of trade, lots of capital, lots of investment. The housing was fairly affordable at that point. My parents got their first house in their late 20s.
Yeah.
Whereas if you fast forward 25 years to now, actually lots of people my age are still living at home at 25 years old.
Yeah.
And the prospect of them getting a mortgage and getting onto the property ladder at 28, 29 is actually really slim.
Yes.
Compared to what our parents experienced.
Yeah.
So I think maybe there's a difficulty in understanding those perspectives for maybe the slightly older generation is just for general state of the economy, it's much harder for young people now when you don't have much money and you're starting the beginning of your career.
Yeah.
I think that's generated a lot of kind of anxiety and a lack of ambition.
Yeah. I think
you're
completely right. And I think mine was kind of the bigger picture start point, and then I think you brought it down to the practical, which for a lot of people is what's most important. And it's not just the housing. So you're right. If you do surveys, and there've been plenty done of your generation, and even sort of younger millennials, there is that belief of I can't own a house. Okay, and it's not a belief; it's practically true. If you look at earnings versus house price and the multiples there, etc., the affordability level is just not there. But that then kicks onto families. So if you look at falling birth rates, and that's a very complex issue, but it does play into this, that if you don't think you can afford somewhere to live, if you're still living at home, chances are you're not going to be having a kid early, and that can stem into, well, actually maybe we just won't have any, or maybe we'll just have one, and you see that falling birth rate occurring. And that's not necessarily what people want. So I mean, for some people they do, but for others it's not really what they want. And so there are various kind of happiness triggers and metrics attached to that, and anxiety metrics attached to that. And I remember I wrote a report a year or two ago now, and as I was writing it, there were 3 young women in the office space that I was working in. They were probably in their late 20s, possibly early 30s. Good London-based jobs. Not exceptional jobs, but good, solid jobs that have been on decent salaries. And one of them asked the other, when are you thinking of having kids? And she just laughed and said, well, when I win the lottery. And they all just nodded along and went, yeah, absolutely, good point. And so if at that sort of socioeconomic context there's that belief of, well, I can't afford to have kids. I definitely haven't bought a house yet. I'm still living in a shared environment where I might possibly try and save for a deposit, but do I really want to do that when it's going to take me 15 years to get there? You can see why, again, those fundamental practical things of life, of having a family, having kids, having a house, if those aren't achievable, or you don't think they are, why would you be ambitious?
Yeah, I think that I think those points might explain why I think it's 13% of people in the UK aged 16 to 24 are unemployed, are out of a job. And I think this statistic has been growing
Yes.
for a couple of years.
Yeah.
So there's those factors we just talked about. But then for a bit of accountability, actually kind of what onus should be placed on Gen Z, and maybe is there a bit of an attitude shift which they've missed, which is impacting this?
So it's great you've asked me that question, and I'd love to get your view, because what I'm very reticent to do is to sound like I'm lecturing Gen Z, because I do believe there's a contextual environment that they've brought up in which is really genuinely difficult, and I think any human being would struggle with that. So I don't want to do that. But there is some truth in your question, which is that we are all fundamentally responsible for our own outcomes and our own lives. And we're not responsible for our context, and that could have made our lives particularly difficult. But nevertheless, we have to take action to move that forward. And I think there is, again, Gen Z have been slightly hampered, but this is where they need to try and build these aspects of their character, is that I think the educational system and the social system, and I've spoken to a lot of teachers about this. I work in the education sector on a voluntary basis as well. And there's lots of surveys around a sense of kind of entitlement, a lack of energy, again, a lack of ambition, even at young age groups. But that cannot be blamed on them. That's got to come from parenting. If you've got kids at school who are already demonstrating some of these issues, that's fundamentally not their fault. That's a parenting issue. So then you have to look at, well, what is it that shifted? And there is probably an issue around responsibilities and consequences and having to stand on your own 2 feet. And it's a part of our culture that has been sort of stripped back to a certain degree. So you do have, I think, Gen Z in the workplace now who aren't necessarily used to the concept of you are fully responsible for your outcomes, and there are consequences that you have to deal with if you don't deliver. One of the things I've seen mentioned many times is just the lack of awareness of, if you don't deliver, you will lose your job. There is almost a feeling of I deserve to be here. You're lucky to have me. Why shouldn't you want me? If I happen to turn up today, you should be grateful for that. It's like, where does that come from? And that's one I don't think I have a fixed answer to yet. But I think in answer to your question, I think there is, an acceptance of responsibility for your own outcomes. I think there's a need to build a sense of resilience and a desire to deal with discomfort. Discomfort is part of growth. If you're not happy to step into discomfort and sit in it and stay in it for a sustained period of time, your ability to grow is reduced. And an understanding that if you're not willing to do those things, there are consequences, and no one else is going to come and rescue you. You have to deal with those consequences. And I think that's a slightly harder message. And again, I'm reticent to shout that too loudly, because I don't think it's fully people's responsibility that they aren't necessarily comfortable with that. But it's a reality that we all have to face as human beings, I think.
No, I'd agree. So from my perspective, the way I see this situation is, I think the older generation have grown up with a society worldview of a top-down hierarchy. Whereas I think the younger generation, we've grown up with a more of an inclusive, collective type of teaching when it comes to general society, the workplace. Obviously, DEI has been a big thing. So I think because we've been brought up on this collectivist, inclusive environment, I think that's actually diminished a bit of self-responsibility. And my opinion is, if someone leaves a baby on your doorstep, it's not your fault, but it's now your responsibility to deal with it.
Yeah.
And I think that's been lost.
Yes. I love that example.
We've had Brexit, we've had Ukraine war, we've had COVID, we've had all of these issues in just my short 25 years. But we still live in the UK, which is a free market, and where meritocracy is still thriving.
Yes.
So I'm of the opinion that there should be a bit more self-responsibility.
Yes.
And I think it's been diminished in this generation. And I think that is probably a big reason for that tension between older generation leaders, kind of maybe leaders in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, when they're managing Gen Z. So I speak on Gen Z. So I think we're missing that.
Yes, and I think that's fair, but it's almost like debating philosophy. It's all well and good having an intellectual discussion of the problem, but ultimately we have to find a solution. And that's my job. My job is to find solutions for companies to go, how do you create a high performance team and a high performance environment? So it's all well and good agreeing on that, but then you get the, well, so what? Now, any team, any business, even like a government department, you're not going to solve that problem overnight, because the root causes of a perception of the world come from your parenting, your early school life, the experiences you've had and are framed from your sort of early teens, mid-teens, late teens, etc. And all the things you've mentioned have embedded certain perspectives. No employer can change that in 6 months. It's not going to happen. So that's why I never push that message too strongly, because it makes leaders feel better if they can say, oh yes, well, Gen Z have got to step up and take responsibility. I'm like, great, but good luck getting someone to do that in 6 months. What you've got to do is, I want to grow a business. I want to achieve an outcome. I want to make the NHS more successful. I want the school to be more successful. You have to deal with the resources you've got. You've got to lead the world that is, not the world you want it to be. So therefore, the question really is, yes, I understand where Gen Z are coming from. So what I do is help people get that understanding. So the conversation we've had helps people to see there are reasons for the behaviours that we're seeing. But then you've got to go, what do we do about it? How do we then help Gen Z to thrive in the workplace, to get what they want out of the world, see what opportunities there are there, and make sure the team functions properly? So I think the problem leaders have got is some of them are just, a lot of them are not adapting to that. So I think there are many friction points, but that one you highlighted is a great one, that kind of collectivist, we're in this together group, everyone at school working together, breaking down that hierarchy. And then you've got a hierarchy. It was like, well, you can't just force one into the other. There has to be a blend between those two models in order to allow those generations to work together. So if leaders aren't willing to adapt, that friction point is not going to go away, and it's only going to get worse. I mean, Gen Alpha are now in school, and they're being schooled under exactly the same process. They're being parented under the same process, and currently they're in a world of even more kind of disruption and friction, and who knows what's going to happen next. So we can't assume that that's going to change. So my point is, leadership has to adapt. The message can't be, well, Gen Z just need to sort themselves out.
What are some practical points which a leader could take if they are managing a team of 18 to 25, 18 to 30, in terms of merging those, I guess, different worldviews together?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? So the problem is society-wide. The problem is universal. The consequences are universal. The solution, unfortunately, is more tactical to your context. So the answer to your question, the answer that I would give, is very different in a startup environment to a FTSE 100 environment, to newly qualified teachers, to a newly qualified doctor. The contexts vary enormously, and therefore the way that you lead the next generation has to adapt to that context. So the answers I give will be general. Mm-hmm. So first off, I think there has to be an appreciation that leadership is now harder. You're having to manage a different context, a different contextual background in an accelerating and fast-moving environment. It's what we call a VUCA environment. You've heard of that before. So, things are very volatile, they're uncertain, they're complex, and there's lots of ambiguity. Leading in that environment is hard, and leaders need to understand it's harder and accept they have to get better, and they need to be supported to do that. Then there needs to be a level of acceptance that the world has changed. There are too many leaders where I walk into a boardroom and people are going, well, how do I get people to do this? Like, you're not going to. You have to change. You have to accept the world has changed. And however much you might not like that, it has, and the quicker you accept that reality, the quicker you can find a way of moving your teams forward together as one. So there's understanding, and then there's acceptance. And then you have to look at, well, how do we start filling in some of those gaps? So I think one of the great positives of Gen Z is, because some of that ambition is hard to find, I think intrinsically They know they want it. Gen Z are much more purpose-driven. When you talk to them, when they're interviewed as a group, they are generally more purpose-driven. Now, almost every organisation can find a way of articulating their purpose. And why are we here? Why do we all bother to get up on a Monday morning? What's the point of what we're trying to achieve? And really clearly linking a purpose to a vision of this is where we're trying to get to, and this is why it's exciting, and this is why we're all in it together, and trying to get everyone to contribute to that. That is something that can be collegiate. Where are we trying to get to? That team ethos. If you can create that, and there are very clear stepping stones you can take to do that, then you start to create that ambition within a group that Gen Z can feel a part of, because it's taking them somewhere. Too many organisations still have that view of, well, you're new, just do what you're told to do, follow the training plan for a year, and then you'll get here. But that's not inspiring. No one believes their future is going to be what you tell them it's going to be, because what their life experience has told them is the future doesn't look that great. So you've got to lay it out really clearly and specifically. So there's the understanding, there's the acceptance, there's the understanding you have to adapt, and then laying out a vision, having a clear purpose. Those are kind of the frameworks you start from. And then I could go on for hours, because there's all the operational stuff. There's how do you actually lead? How do you communicate? All the practical stuff that we can talk about, but I think that's probably the start to the answer to your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the communicating purpose is such a big piece, and it's probably a bit underrated. On a podcast about 18 months ago, I heard this really brilliant example. In the UK, there was this cleaning company doing 10 million pounds revenue a year. And the founder wanted to scale it to 100 million revenue before exiting. And his issue was he couldn't motivate and inspire his team, who were working in what's considered a fairly boring business, cleaning, to push the boundaries to go from 10 to 100. And what he ended up doing was rephrasing the purpose. So instead of saying our goal is to hit 100 million, their goal was to save 250 lives a year in the UK. And the reason the way they were going to do this was by servicing the factories and the labs where ready meals are prepared. So 250 people a year get food poisoning and are hospitalised from picking up sandwiches and pastas and ready meals from Sainsbury's, Tesco's, and all of these supermarkets. So he repositioned the purpose to save 250 lives by cleaning the environments where ready meals are prepared. And then in 5 years after, they scaled to 100 million.
Fantastic.
So they found a new target, and he really inspired the team, not through finance, but through purpose. And it was just a really clever tweak of the communication to the team. And I think our generation is much more receptive to something as powerful as that. And I think it's a good example of what is considered a boring company. Respectful, but quite boring. And they put a really powerful spin on it.
I think that's a fantastic example. And that's just what I'm saying. It's connecting it to something that feels tangible and real, that allows people to drive that purpose. And there's still a financial outcome. There's nothing wrong with a financial outcome, but people actually care and they want to be a part of that. And that's what we need. We need that excitement. And someone else gave me a great example of, not every leader is going to be someone who wants to stand up and say, this is where we're going, this is really exciting, because great leadership isn't always that character type, but you can get it from the group. I was speaking to another founder who had a team of only 25, so a really small business. But he had a similar problem of how do I take these young people and move them forward to something exciting. So he created I can't remember exactly the wording, but it was a growth team. So of that 25, there were 8 of them, all from different levels. So from the newest grad up to the CEO. And then once a month they had a meeting where there was no hierarchy. So anyone could say anything to anybody else. And the only thing they started with is, we've agreed our goal for the next 3 years is this. How do we want to get there? How do we achieve it? How do we work together so we're all happy? We're doing really well. Our clients are really happy. What do we do? And everyone contributed to that ideas process. All ideas were considered. People would go away and research things. So you had that shared kind of collegiate approach within that meeting and context. But outside of that, you had the normal hierarchy in the business. But everyone felt at every level that they were really part of that discussion. Now, when I sit in a large business and have that discussion, they're like, well, we've got 10,000 people. How could we possibly do that? Like, well, why don't you sublet some of this decision making to smaller units. If you're in a large company, you will have a division, you will have teams, you'll have regional teams doing their own thing. And as long as they operate within certain guidelines, let them choose for themselves what's their purpose. What are they trying to achieve within the big picture? And allow them to own that process. And then you get that desire and that drive because they feel a part of something rather than just sort of a big mass of nothing that they can't control. And that really works for people. It does help. I mean, the example I give, because people still think some of this stuff is very soft and fluffy, but leadership is just about emotion. If you take two teams, now, hypothetical, but some of these exist, you have two teams that are identical. So you've got the same number of people, same mix of male and female, race, social economic context, educational background, you take the same mix. Now, one team wakes up and they feel confident, they feel inspired, they feel the team have got their back, that their boss is there for them, that they're respected and valued within the organisation. You take the other team, and they feel like no one really respects what they do. They feel that they might get fired at any point in time. They feel undervalued. They feel disrespected. Now, you and I both know, and anyone I talk to knows, this team is going to massively outperform this team. And what's the difference? It's just their emotional state. That is it. So anyone who says these kind of conversations are soft and fluffy completely misunderstands what high performance is. If you just change someone's emotional state, you will get incredible performance or total underperformance. So that purpose, that drive, that ambition that's connected to meaning, that is what makes the difference. Makes people excel and succeed in life.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we're emotional beings.
Yes.
In terms of, what would you say are some of the strengths of Gen Z? What could be essentially exploited by leaders when they have a young workforce? What can they really be taken advantage of?
So I think the number one point that I will always come back to is adaptability. So the human strength, what we as humans are the number one at, is adaptability. That's why we are here where we are today. We adapt to all circumstances. Now, that tends to lessen over time. So if you look at the average 60 to 70-year-old, chances are they are very, very firmly rooted in, this is what I do, this is how I do it, this is my perspective on the world, and I'm not going to change. There are exceptions to that, but as a general rule of thumb, that's the perspective. If you take the average 20 to 25-year-old, generally, again, generalizations, generally the opposite. Generally more open-minded, generally more flexible, generally more adaptable to what's going on around them. They can change their mind, they can go in different directions. They are raw potential in comparison. And it's the same when you go through the age bracket. So you get to sort of 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, you see that dwindling of adaptability. People become more fixed in their approach and their mindset. So the big problem we've got right now, as we touched on at the beginning, is just how fast things are changing. So there's all those things that you mentioned of disruption. But if you add in AI and everything else, that disruption is accelerating aggressively. You look at most organizations, their pace of change is off the charts. Now, if you're later in your age bracket, your ability to adapt to that is not great, because at the pace at which you can just about get your head around that change, it's already changed again and it's moved on, and you just can't keep up. Whereas if you're early 20s, you can keep up. You've been brought up in an environment that's been disrupted, that has changed, and so actually your potential for adaptability consistently to maintain a way of dealing with all that change is brilliant. You naturally have lots of energy. You naturally have lots of desire to make things better. And that's part of the friction, because Gen Z can see things aren't working very well. And therefore, they are a bit disconnected to what the older generations are doing, because they're thinking, well, this isn't working very well. But you can harness that. If someone really feels this isn't working very well, great. Well, how would you fix it? What would you do? What do you want to do? If I give you that freedom, what would you do? Take all the tech you can use. Take ChatGPT. Knock yourself out. What ideas can you come up with? If you give people that freedom, it is amazing what people will come up with. And I think that is the potential of Gen Z. They are the part of our society that is able to adapt to the incredibly fast pace of change we're now going through.
Do you think there's going to be an element of natural selection of leaders in the next 10, 15 years? So the leaders who can take advantage of what you just mentioned, their companies will go like this.
Mhm.
And then the leaders who don't and try and stay stuck in their ways.
Yeah.
And so it feels like a kind of a square peg in a round hole. Do you think there's going to be a bit of natural selection happening?
I think history tells us that when we're at an inflection point, when we're at a serious period of change, which I think everyone would agree we're going through at this point in time, you will have people who thrive in that and others who kind of fall out. And unfortunately, for leaders who are in those older age brackets, you're very much going to get what you've just said. There are those leaders who are still able and willing to think in pace of change. They're willing to adapt. Those will thrive. And if they can communicate that to their younger generations and work together, yes, those organisations will undoubtedly do incredible things. But unfortunately, the kind of the normal day-to-day status quo leadership is already really creaking under pressure. Gallup released their annual survey recently. They do a global leadership survey, and one of the things they pointed out was the depth of increasing disengagement at a managerial level. So that management level, where not necessarily at the end of their career, but sort of mid to senior management, the disengagement is noticeable. It's really starting to drop, and quickly, because there's a lot of people in there who just felt they were on a fixed path of progression and just had to work hard and keep doing what they're doing. And that's all starting to fall apart because actually you have to adapt. You have to deal with a new generation doing things in a different way. You have to deal with the fact your organisation is adopting technology that you don't understand, but you've got to get your head around it really quickly because it will change again in 6 months' time, and it will change again, and it will keep flowing and adapting. And if your mindset is fixed, you've got no chance. So I think, as I said, when you're at that inflection point, you will see people thrive and you will see people drop out. And that's not a good thing, because we need to do something to try and keep as many people as possible, succeeding and thriving. But unfortunately, that's very hard to do, and I think we will see that differential.
Yeah. I guess on the flip side of a coin, there's one topic I wanted to bring up is I think there's a perception, and maybe it shows up in the statistics as well, that Gen Z job hop a lot more. They don't tend to last too long in jobs.
Yes.
I've got an opinion on this, but before I share it, I'd like to know kind of firstly, is this actually true? Are Gen Z hopping? And secondly, what do you think the reasons are for this?
So I think the answer is yes, they are, but it's controversial for some reason because people can play with stats in many different ways. But I think what is very safe to say that certainly socially and culturally, it is more acceptable now to start a job in a white-collar job, knowledge-based job in London, and then 6, 12, 18 months later go, you know what, I'm going to go and try something else. 30 years ago, that was not as socially and culturally as acceptable. That was frowned upon. And when you put your CV into another company, they'd look at that and go, well, I can't trust you. And you wouldn't have got that next job. Whereas that is increasingly not the case. There is much more flexibility in the work environment. Now, whether that's a good or bad thing is where the debate, I think, really, really comes up. But I think the reason why people are doing it is, again, because of that, I don't know where the future's taking me. I don't know where I'm going. Why should I commit to this? If you look at the classic employers in say, London, if you look at media, if you look at finance, you look at technology, legal, accounting, all of those things, that pathway that previously existed and was clearly laid out does not exist. Anyone entering one of those professions now cannot look at directors and partners and go, that'll be me. How could you possibly say that? The technological effect on all those industries is so fast that we're already seeing big swathes of those organisations either losing their jobs or changing their jobs. So the pathway has completely disintegrated. So when you come into that job, you can't look up and go, well, I'll stick at this because in 10 years' time I'll be there. So would it be rational to stay? So the only rational thing is, well, I'll stay while I'm learning. I'll stay while I'm gaining something from this and I'm growing as a human being, if you're thinking, to that depth. But after 18 months, 2 years, and someone goes, well, we can give you a promotion. You're like, well, why? Do I want that? What's that going to give me? You expect more of me for some more money, but is that going to take me any further? I'm not sure it will. Actually, I might go and try something else because that will bring more skills and I'll understand more and maybe I can then work out where to take that later on. So if you look at the pace of change we're in, I think job hopping could be argued as rational. Depends why you're doing it. If you're doing it just because you can't be bothered. If you're doing it because you've hit a period of discomfort or you just don't like something, then I think that's unhealthy. Because there is, I think, an element of society that just thinks life should be easy, that life should be fun. And what I'm about to say comes from a couple of Gen Zs I've spoken to. This doesn't come from me. They said to me, I have grown up looking at social media where I can see people making millions of pounds with a ring light in their bedroom or from a beach. I've grown up seeing that on Instagram. So why should life be difficult? If that's what you've been fed constantly. Now, the reason I've never raised that, because I always thought that was a bit of a myth. I'm like, is that really true? But that's been said to me by Gen Z people I've spoken to. And well, you can understand then. Why would you want to commit to what's a bit of a hard graft, difficult route for a few years, when in your head, I can just sit in my room and earn millions of pounds, so why should I do that?
No, it's a really interesting point. I can totally see how I don't agree with it, but I can see how people land with that worldview who are young. And for example, when I was 13, 14 years old, I didn't watch TV, I watched YouTube. Yeah. And I watched people like KSI, and you fast forward 10, 15 years, this bloke is worth probably £500 million.
Yes.
So I think that has massively warped, I guess, Gen Z's perception when it comes to money, finance, hard work, jobs. There is one element which I think is actually where the ball is in the court of the leaders, which I think they've dropped the ball on. And this is coming out of COVID. Lots of companies do hybrid working.
Yes.
And I think there's been a really... they've dropped the ball on the communication piece. And what I mean by this is one of my friends, he applied for a job, and the job spec was flexible working, 1 or 2 days a week in the office.
Yes.
And they painted this lovely culture. He went through the interviews and he got the job. And on the first week of the job, it became apparent that actually the reality is you have to be in the office 5 days a week, and it's 8 a.m. till 8:30 p.m.
Wow.
Now,
so they just lied.
They lied.
Okay.
Now, I'm not. There's nothing wrong if your company has to be. If your employees have to be in the office 5 days a week, and they have to work 11, 12-hour shifts. There's nothing wrong with that. That's your company and you own it. But where my issue sits is how you market the job. And I think this has led to a higher churn, because if companies aren't clear and own what their culture exactly is, and they sell you a dream that doesn't exist, then of course there's going to be a higher churn rate.
Of course. Absolutely.
So I just think that clarity on job specs specifically, that sits in the court of the leaders to communicate properly.
Yes.
And not try and fluff something up to what they think might appeal to Gen Z, but doesn't sit in reality.
Yes. Well, let me address that directly. So I think your example is you're being far too nice in that example. That they're just lying.
Yeah.
And any organisation that lies has no right to exist, in my view. Commercially, that will come back to bite you at some point in time. You're certainly not going to grow because your employees will just leave. So that is just wrong. There's no kind of grey area around that. It is wrong. Where I thought you were going with that is the grey area which most companies fall into, where, even saying something like flexible working and 1 to 2 days in the office, is like, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
That's vague. And therefore, expectations are going to be misaligned. So if I say to someone who's 22, is like, right, you can work flexibly and you'll be in the office 1 or 2 days a week. What they hear is, I can basically work where I want, when I want, for 4 days a week. I'll be in the office 1 day a week. And I can probably start when I want to. What the client's saying is, you'll be in 2 days a week, you'll be in at 8 a.m, you'll leave at 6 p.m, and when you're working from home, I want to know exactly where you are and what you're doing. Now, those two sets of expectations are so aggressively misaligned, you're only going to get friction. So that, I think, is very common. It's extremely common, because people haven't had the courage to grasp the nettle here, which goes back to what I've been saying all the way through. The world has changed, and leaders have to adapt to that. We are not going back to a world of 5 days a week in the office, 9 to 5. It is just not happening. And also, I would argue it's not optimal, because the reality is, if you take a group of, say, 30 to 40-year-olds who've got kids, it is now highly arguable that actually most of the time working from home probably does produce a more productive, more successful, more coherent team. A bit more complicated than that, but I think the evidence is starting to say that's true. Now, if you take a group of young 20-somethings, that is different because at the beginning of your career, you do need support. You need training. You need that emotional connection around you. You need team. You need development. All of that. You need that learning by osmosis of being around other people. But at the same time, it's highly unlikely that requires you to be in a fixed office location 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. That's unlikely. So some flexibility is required. But what people aren't doing is doing the thought process of what do we actually need? Why do we need to be in an office? What is it we want to achieve from that time being in the office? And therefore, what is it this role and this person needs to do in order to fit in with that? So they've got to do the thinking. And then, as you say, they've got to communicate it with absolute clarity. Like absolute clarity. So that job description has got to be, this is what the role is, this is what we need from you, and this is how we expect you to deliver it in detail. That happens at interview, and then it actually gets delivered operationally every single day. So I think you've hit a nail on the head there with that communication issue, and it's from a lack of courage. People don't want to face up to these difficult changes and communicate exactly how they're going to deal with it.
Yeah, definitely. David, as a final question, let's end this on a high. Why are you so passionate about it, and what's your hope for the future?
So my whole working life has been about people. You know, from when I stepped out of university into the military, I have commanded, led, and trained people. I was training 16 and 17-year-olds at one point to go and do really difficult jobs. And then I moved into headhunting, started my own search firm. All I've ever done is deal with people. And as cliched as this might sound, my fulfillment and love comes from seeing people thrive. There is nothing that frustrates me more than seeing individuals and teams who are just struggling, who are in pain, and suffering for no reason. All of this can be dealt with. And right now, we are in a point of real friction where there is genuine suffering. If you look at the statistics around engagement in the workplace, you look at the mental health statistics, you look at relationship statistics, there are some serious friction points in our society, so much of which can be easily at least moved in the right direction through positive, engaged leadership, and leadership that really understands the problems that we're facing right now and how to react better to that. So that's why I'm so passionate about that, and I really want to have an impact on that. And my hope for the future is that I think, as with every change, there is so much opportunity. So if I can help to clarify, look, this is where we are, let's build some understanding of that, and let's take advantage of the opportunities that this change brings. Gen Z are different because of their context, but as we touched on earlier, they therefore have different strengths and they have different potential. Instead of trying to, hammer them into a form of what we used to be, let's take what they are and allow them to thrive and learn from that, and we can all create a really exceptional future. But we've got to accept where we are and adapt to the opportunities that are ahead of us.
Yeah, fantastic. You speak on this subject so well because you have that passion, but then you also have the facts and details anchored in research that you've done, and also by speaking to, I guess, younger people. So, yeah, thanks for your time, David. It was great to chat.
Well, thank you very much for the conversation. I really enjoyed it.